In this video contribution, we will go through two simulation experiments and their results. But before all this, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Enrico Cozzoni, and I am the R&D Director of Grade Zero Space. I'm in charge in the IAMRRI project for the development of the model, its verification and validation, its refinement and the related calibration, including the execution of all the simulation experiments. The simulation I will present are two of the several experiments carried out, executed during the verification and validation campaign, in which we tested the correspondence between the conceptual model and the IAMRRI agent-based model. In the first simulation experiment, we wanted to observe the role of regulatory bodies in spreading ethical values, assessing the societal effect of the regulators, and what might be a better policy to adopt. The aim was that to answering to questions such as, what happens if the selection of innovation ideas based on the network's ethical values becomes more stringent? Will the other array values spread more rapidly? How will this affect agents and related innovation networks? One of the methodologies used in verifying and validating the model, it was that named relative value testing, in which we examine how the outputs vary as the inputs vary. According to this premise, in the second simulation experiment we will present, we used RRI attractiveness as the input variable, while all other independent variables were considered control variables. And we studied the average heterogeneity of networks as the output variable. In the first experiment, as mentioned before, we wondered if a more stringent regulation on the RRI ethical thinking variable could somehow favor the diffusion of the remaining RRI keys, and what was the impact on the number of agents participating into a network. The input variables, but not of interest, also called control variables, were therefore assigned according to the values shown in table 1 that you can see on the left. Then 300 simulation runs of 30 steps each were performed, in which regulator parameters were set at 3 levels, 0.5, 0.3, 0.5, and 0.8. The variable of interest of this experiment that you can see on the right part of the screen were the 3 RRI keys: open access, ethical thinking, public engagement, and the number of agents involved in the innovation network. The steps or fix of greatest interest that were selected have been the step 4 and the step 6, chosen because they follow the spreading mechanism of the RRI values, and the step 30 as final step in the simulation. Descriptive statistics were performed on the outputs. The first test was the analysis of variance, or ANOVA test, to divide experimental variance into statistically independent rates, and so to isolate the variance linked to the factor understood to obtain information on the effects exerted. Specifically, one-way ANOVA was performed, followed by a post-hoc test, the honestly significant difference HSD test of Taki. Let's go to see the more significant results in the steps selected. Step 4, accepting the first rate risk of 5%, we can consider the regulator parameter statistically significant for the RRI ethical thinking key, while we cannot reject the null hypothesis of ineffectiveness of the regulator parameter on the remaining RRI keys. At step 6, the results lead us to consider the effect produced by the regulator parameter on all the 3 RRI keys to be significant. However, the multiple comparison performed with the HSD test lead us to consider the difference between the means to be insignificant for RRI keys for regulator levels of 0.3 and 0.5, but significant for comparison with regulator factor levels of 0.3, 0.8, and 0.5, 0.8. Similar results apply to step 30. Therefore, we can consider that an increase in the regulator parameter corresponds to a significant increase in the mean of the RRI values as final result. According to these results, it would seem that it would be enough to regulator to focus more on the ethical thinking of companies to encourage the use and the spreading of RRI practices. Clearly not. In fact, too stringent legislation corresponds to a dramatic drop in the number of innovation networks, as emerged also from the workshops of the IAMRRI project. In fact, we need to leave some room for the innovators without rushing to regulate, clearly understanding when and how to regulate. The literature presents us with a reality in which an increase in the use of RRI practices corresponds to a greater heterogeneity within innovation project and related innovation networks. Therefore, we asked ourselves in the second experiment proposed if even in our model, the greater weight given to the RRI values during the selection of partners corresponds to an increase in the heterogeneity of the actors involved in the innovation network. To this end, we have introduced an additional variable to measure the heterogeneity of the networks, expressed as the number of different breeds or type of agents out of the total number of the network participants. The control variables are shown in table 3 on the left part of the screen, while 300 simulation run, 30 steps were performed for 3 different weights of the RRI values that you can read on the table on the right part of the screen. RRI values in the selection of the partners, while the output variable has been exactly the heterogeneity of the networks. As you can see from the scatter plot in the left part, in the table in the left part of the screen, an increase in the weight of the RRI values in the selection of partners corresponds to an increase in the heterogeneity of the networks. Furthermore, the results of one-way ANOVA test lead us to reject the null hypothesis of ineffectiveness of the RRI attractiveness factor, accepting a first rate risk of 5%. Even the usual postdoc tests executed, specifically HSD study, persuade us to consider the difference between the means of heterogeneity compared for the various weights given to the RRI values in the selection of partners to be significant. The literature search results show that an increase in the diffusion and importance given to RRI practice corresponds to an increase in the heterogeneity within the innovation system, within the innovation network. That is exactly in line with how IAMRRI evidence-based model behaves and performs, so reinforcing the conceptual correctness of our simulation model.